All right, let's dive into this U.S. budget battle thing. Seems like a lot of you are pretty interested in this based on all the stuff you sent our way.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic right
I
now.
mean, we got news articles, analyses, even some of that social media chatter.
It's definitely gotten people fired up.
So let's try to break it down. What's actually happening in Washington, and why should anyone outside the Beltway even care?
Well, the core issue is President Trump. He wants to push through some pretty big spending plans. We're talking extending those tax cuts, more funding for border security, boosting the military, all that stuff.
And that stuff doesn't exactly come cheap.
No, not at all. And the problem is we're doing all this while facing a pretty serious federal deficit.
Okay, so it's not just about whether we can afford it, but also, like, should we be spending like this in the first place, right? Even within Trump's own party, the Republicans, there's pushback.
Oh, absolutely. You've got these budget hawks, that's what they call them.
Yeah.
The Republicans who are like laser focused on cutting spending wherever they can,
They're probably looking at that deficit and getting a little nervous.
for sure. Their argument is that a growing deficit is going to have some serious long-term consequences. Think inflation, higher interest rates,
Yeah.
basically less financial flexibility for the whole country down the line.
Makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly racking up debt, it's going to catch up to you eventually, right?
Exactly. But then you have Republicans like Representative Maliotakis, who's from New York. She's worried about the other side of the coin, like the actual people who might be hurt by these spending cuts.
Right, because she represents a district with a lot of people who rely on Medicaid.
Yeah, so she's voiced concerns about what happens to their health care if these cuts go through. It puts her in a tough spot, you know?
Yeah, trying to stay loyal to her party, but also represent the needs of her constituents. It shows how these budget battles aren't just some abstract political game.
Right. They have real-world consequences for everyday people.
And that's why we're trying to break it down.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of breaking things down, how does Congress actually make these decisions? I keep hearing about budget reconciliation, but honestly, it sounds like something out of a legal textbook.
Well, it's definitely a process.
Not the most exciting one, I'm guessing.
Not really, but it's important to understand how this whole thing works. Think of Congress as having two paths for passing laws.
Okay, I'm following.
You have the regular path, which needs 60 votes in the Senate to avoid getting blocked, filibustered. And then you have this other lane, this reconciliation lane, which only needs 51 votes to pass.
So it's like an express lane, but for budget stuff specifically?
Yeah, you could say that, but it's not a free-for-all. It can only be used for certain things, adjusting spending, changing revenue, and dealing with the debt limit.
Right, can't just use it to, like, sneak in a law about something completely random.
Exactly. And there's this thing called the Byrd Rule, which adds another layer of complexity.
Boy, more rules.
Basically, it says any provision included in reconciliation has to directly impact the budget. You can't just tack on unrelated things just because it's easier to pass.
Makes sense. Gotta have some boundaries. But hasn't this always been the way Congress has done things?
Not really. Reconciliation was actually first used in 1980.
Oh, so it's relatively new.
Yeah, compared to the long history of Congress.
Ah.
But it's become a lot more common in recent years, especially as Congress has become more divided along party lines.
So it's a symptom of that gridlock.
You could say that. It's a way for the party in power to get some things done, specifically budget-related things, without needing bipartisan support.
And we've seen both parties use this before.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Think back to the 2017 tax cuts under Trump. That was reconciliation. And more recently, Democrats used it for the COVID relief package and the Inflation Reduction Act.
So reconciliation is the how, but the real battle is over the what actually goes into it.
Right. And right now, Republicans, even though they control the House, they're having a tough time getting on the same page about their budget resolution.
Meaning, like, their plan for how they want to use reconciliation.
Exactly. You've got at least 4 of those budget hawks we talked about who've come out publicly against it, saying it doesn't cut spending enough for their liking.
And 4 votes is enough to sink the whole thing.
Yep. That's all it takes.
Wow, that's some pressure.
Definitely puts Speaker Johnson in a tough spot trying to rally his troops with all this division going on.
So what are these representatives who are against the plan, what are they actually worried about?
Well, you have Representative Massey, who's been pretty vocal about it. He's basically questioning why he'd vote for something that increases the deficit, which is what this plan does.
Makes sense from his perspective, I guess.
And then you've got Representative Davidson, who's linking his support to having a clear plan for funding the government past March 14th.
March 14th. Why that date?
That's when a bunch of government agencies could face a partial shutdown if Congress doesn't act.
Oh, wow. So the stakes are pretty high.
Oh, yeah. They're worried about the long-term consequences of, spending beyond our means. They want a more fiscally responsible approach.
So what's Speaker Johnson saying about all this? I mean, how's he trying to navigate this mess?
Well, his last statement was pretty vague. He basically said, there may be a vote tonight, may not be. Stay tuned.
Talk about a cliffhanger.
Right. Classic political maneuvering, keeping everyone guessing. Adds to the drama, for sure.
So let me just recap here. We've got this powerful tool, budget reconciliation, but a divided party trying to use it. And all this is happening against a backdrop of some very real concerns about overspending.
And we haven't even touched on some of the other controversies brewing, like Medicaid and Trump's foreign policy moves.
That's right. We've got a lot more to unpack, so stay with us as we continue this deep dive.
We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into this crazy budget battle that's got everyone in Washington talking.
Before the break, we were talking about Trump and his push for healthcare price transparency. It seems like a good thing on the surface, but...
Yeah, you think so, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to know how much their healthcare is going to cost up front?
Exactly. It seems like making hospitals and insurance companies reveal their prices should be, like, a no-brainer.
It really should. The whole idea is that if everyone knows the costs, right from the start, it'll create competition. And that should, in theory at least, push prices down for patients.
So more transparency should lead to better choices, better deals, better healthcare for everyone.
Exactly. Transparency is usually a good thing, right? Especially when we're talking about something as important as healthcare.
But if it's such a good idea, what's been stopping it from working?
Well, the healthcare industry itself has been a big roadblock, to be honest. Back when similar transparency rules were put in place, this was during Trump's first term, there was a ton of pushback.
Really? From who?
Mainly from the hospitals and insurance companies themselves. Some just flat out refused to publish their prices like they were told.
Wow, that's bold.
And the ones that did comply, well, they often made the information super hard to find. Like, you'd have to be a detective to dig it up.
So they were basically playing hide and seek with information that patients need to make informed decisions about their own care.
Pretty much. Some buried the info deep within their websites or used all this complicated code to make it invisible to search engines.
Sneaky. I mean, that defeats the whole purpose of transparency, right?
Exactly. Patients should be able to compare prices for procedures or treatments just like they shop for anything else.
It would be a game changer. But even if healthcare prices become more transparent, there's still the big elephant in the room. The federal budget itself.
Oh, absolutely. All the spending we've been talking about, whether it's border security, the military, even those potential tax cuts, it all has to be looked at in the context of the deficit and the national debt.
Okay, so quick reminder for those of us who aren't, like, economists, what are those exactly, and why should we care?
All right, so the deficit is the difference between what the government spends in a year and what it takes in through taxes and stuff. When we spend more than we bring in, that's a deficit, which then gets added to the national debt, which is basically all those deficits, piled up over time.
Okay, makes sense. But why should we care?
Because a big national debt, one that keeps growing, can cause some serious problems down the line. It can lead to higher interest rates, which makes it more expensive for the government to borrow money.
And that affects everyone, right?
Exactly. It can slow down economic growth, limit our ability to deal with future challenges, like if there's a recession or a natural disaster.
Sounds like we're basically, like, mortgaging our future if we don't get this under control.
That's a good way to put it. The decisions being made right now in this budget battle, they're going to have ripple effects for years and years to come.
We can't just think about today. We got to think about the long-term health of the country. And speaking of the future, we got to talk about the role technology is playing in all this. We've been hearing a lot about Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Why is he involved in all this?
Well, Musk's vision for DOGE is pretty straightforward. Streamline government operations, cut out all the unnecessary bureaucracy, and ultimately reduce spending.
Which sounds good in theory.
Yeah, it does. But it stirred up a lot of controversy, Not everyone's on board with his methods.
Like those 21 DOGE employees who quit, what were their concerns specifically?
They were worried about some of the potential unintended consequences of DOGE's approach. They argued that some of the changes he was proposing could actually damage government systems, put sensitive data at risk, and even disrupt important public services.
So it's like fixing one problem but creating a bunch of new ones in the process.
You could say that.
Okay.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences, and it highlights that tension between innovation and tradition. trying to shake things up while also preserving what's already working.
It also raises questions about how much influence private individuals and companies should have when it comes to shaping government policy.
Definitely. Is it appropriate for someone like Elon Musk, with his own, unique worldview and business interests, to have such a big say in how the government operates?
Big questions with no easy answers.
Yeah. And it shows how this budget battle is about way more than just, crunching numbers and balancing the books.
It's about values, about priorities, about the future of the country.
Exactly. And the choices we make today are going to have a lasting impact.
So we've got political maneuvering, we've got economic concerns, we've got tech billionaires throwing their weight around. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but it's also a great example of how even something like the federal budget can be really engaging and relevant to our lives. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore what all of this might mean for you, the listener.
Okay, so we're back, and I think it's safe to say that this U.S. budget battle is, well, pretty complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely not just about, crunching numbers. There's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
We've seen how these procedural tools, like budget reconciliation, are being used, and even within the Republican Party, there's a lot of disagreement about how to spend money.
And it's important to remember the human impact of all of this. We talked about Representative Malliotakis and the people she represents, people who rely on programs like Medicaid. Their lives could be directly affected by the decisions being made.
And all of this is happening while the U.S. is dealing with a bunch of stuff on the world stage. Trump's foreign policy decisions, especially his stance on the war in Ukraine, have stirred up controversy both at home and abroad.
It's a lot to keep track of, that's for sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try to answer the question that's probably on everyone's mind. What does all of this mean for me, the average person?
Yeah, because it's easy to get lost in the political drama, but at the end of the day, these decisions have real consequences for people's lives.
Exactly. So, for example, if you rely on Medicaid for healthcare, or someone you know does, potential cuts to that program could have a huge impact.
And even beyond specific programs, the overall health of the economy is at stake here. The deficit and the national debt, those aren't just abstract ideas. They affect things like interest rates, inflation, economic growth stuff that hits everyone's wallets eventually.
And we can't forget about technology and how it's changing the game. Elon Musk and his DOGE initiative, they've shown us how private companies and individuals are trying to disrupt the government. And that raises some interesting questions about who's really in control.
It's like, are we really a democracy if billionaires can just come in and start changing things?
It's a valid question. And it highlights the fact that we can't just assume the government is always acting in our best interests.
So what can we do? How can we, as regular people, make our voices heard in all of this?
Well, first of all, stay informed. You're already doing that by listening to this deep dive. But don't just rely on headlines or sound bites. Dig deeper. Research the issues. Understand the different viewpoints.
And don't be afraid to reach out to your elected officials, the people who represent you. Write letters, make phone calls, attend town hall meetings. Let them know what you think.
You can also support organizations that are fighting for the causes you believe in. There are tons of groups out there working on everything from healthcare to the environment to social justice. Find one that resonates with you and get involved.
At the end of the day, this is your country, and your future is being shaped by these decisions. Don't just sit back and let others decide for you. Get involved, stay engaged, and be the change you want to see.
And as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this thought. The budget isn't just about dollars and cents. It's a reflection of our values as a nation. What we choose to fund, what we choose to cut, those decisions say a lot about who we are and what we prioritize.
So as you continue to follow this story, and we hope you do, ask yourself, what kind of future do I want for this country? And what am I willing to do to make that future a reality?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and hopefully even a little bit empowering.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.